Hi, welcome back to Let's Go Crafting. I'm Connie. This is the second video in our Learn to Knit series. If you've missed the first video on casting on, please click the link in the description. In this video, we're going to learn the garter stitch, which is basically knitting every row. So let's get started. If you watched the first video, we've now cast on, and you should have approximately 40 stitches on your needle. So each stitch, just as a reminder, each stitch is one of these loops. And I have 40. What you want to check before we get started is that your loops can move freely back and forth on your needle. They shouldn't be super loose, but you should be able to move them. Let's slide them closer to the tip of the needle. And now we're going to learn how to do our first knit stitch. So knitting is a lot like casting on. You'll put your needle into the first stitch. You'll bring the yarn from the ball of yarn through the center of your needles. Your right needle will turn 90 degrees and you'll push the yarn through the loop. Now, when we were casting on, we were adding a stitch every row, we were adding a stitch each time. And that, when you did that, you just added the stitch. You moved it from the right to the left. But now we're happy with the number of stitches on our needle. So we don't want to add anymore. We want the stitches on the needles to remain 40 for each row, or whatever you chose to cast on. So now I have my new stitch here and the old stitch here, the one that I was knitting in. So I'm going to just push the old stitch off the edge. And I'm going to pull this one snug. And now I'm going to do the next stitch. I'm going to stick the tip of my needle into the stitch, pull my yarn around the back, and go through the center, leaving my yarn to the right. Now I've gone into the old stitch. The stitch that I'm creating now on the right hand side is my new stitch. So now I have the new stitch on the right hand side, and I'm going to push the old stitch off the tip. One thing that can help you is you always want to try and keep your fingers near the tips of your needles, and then you won't have to struggle so much getting the loops on and off. Another thing is, if you have your fingers near the tips, your stitches are less likely to hop off your needles. So let's do another one. I've got, my left finger is on my next stitch that I want to stitch into. My right index finger is holding these two stitches. So I'm going to take my right needle and I'm going to go into the stitch from back to front. I'm going to take my yarn. So now that my needle is in, I've got my left hand index finger is holding these stitches in place. I'm going to take my yarn and I'm going to come from back and through the center off to the right, and then I'm going to turn my needle 90 degrees, push the yarn through the center just like we did in the last video. I have my new stitch here. This is my old stitch. I'm going to push it off the tip. And now we're just going to keep doing that all the way to the end of this row. So this is called a row. It's a row of stitches. And when we talk about going to the end of the row, we mean knitting each stitch, or whatever stitch you're doing, to the end of the row. So I'm just going to quickly knit to the end of the row. Remember, I've been knitting probably for about maybe 45 years. So if you're not as fast, that would be why. So each stitch on the left hand needle, my right hand needle goes into it. I wrap the yarn around and then pull the old stitch off, making sure that I only pull one stitch off at a time. You want to make sure you're only wrapping your yarn around the right hand needle, as the yarn needs to come through the center. And then you just keep going all the way to the end until all of the stitches go from will be transferred from the left hand side, the left hand needle, to the right hand needle. And if you notice, my knitting is kind of wrapping around the needle. That's totally normal. So you just kind of put it back. And it'll do that until we get a little bit of length on our fabric here, because that's what we're actually creating, is a piece of fabric. Well, I'm almost there. Only got a few more left. If you notice, as I'm going, I'm pushing these these next stitches closer to the tip. You can see where your needle goes from kind of a big cylinder and then it starts to taper to a point. When you're moving your stitches forward, just move it right till the stitch is right before where it starts to taper. And that seems to be what works the best for me. And hopefully that will work the best for you as well. I have a little knot in there. I'm just going to keep going and keep going till I get to the end. Now, when you're first learning to knit, it's very easy to either drop a stitch or to add some extra stitches. So each time you complete a row, so now I only have 2 stitches left, so I'm gonna make the new one, drop the old one off, make a new one, and drop the last one off. So now my left hand needle is empty and all of the stitches have been transferred to my right side needle. Something I do periodically, and when I was first learning to knit, I did every time, was I would count them each row. So I'm going to count to make sure I still have 40. Let's see, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20, 30, 2, 4, 6, 8, 40. I still have 40 stitches, so I'm good to go. If I had less or more than 40, I would want to kind of check it out. I'll do another video on kind of different issues you might have. An easy way to see if your stitches are good is they'll be straight up and down from the fabric like that. If you've added a stitch, you'll have a slanty stitch. It'll look slanted. So now we're ready to go on to the next row. So now you take your needle was in your right hand, you give it to your left hand, and you turn it, and now you're ready to stitch again. Now what you're doing is the knit stitch. So now you just go back into that first stitch, take your yarn to the back, bring it through to the front, 90-degree angle, and push it through, and then shove that old stitch off. Now you're going to keep doing the same thing row after row until your fabric is about the same length as it is in width. We want to make a square. So as you knit, you're going to notice that it gets longer and longer. And so I'm making a dishcloth, and so if you're going to make a dishcloth, you're going to want a square or approximately square. So After a while, you're going to measure how long it is or how wide it is, and you want to make it in the same width. So width and length should be the same. So I will meet you back here when mine is the same, the width and the length, and then we'll go on from there. Thank you so much for joining us. If you liked this video and you'd like to be notified of when the next one's coming out, please subscribe and press the bell. And then the best way to help out our channel is to like and share it so everybody else can know.